to avoid this sort of siloed supplier selection, we really believe that collaboration is the key.
Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast.
I'm here with Matthew Holt, co-founder and managing director at Collaborative Sourcing. Today, we'll be talking about the strategic foundation that makes or breaks pharmaceutical outsourcing decisions, why the planning phase is so critical, how to build the right cross-functional teams, and the frameworks that separate successful partnerships from costly mistakes. It's great to have you on, Matthew. Can you tell me then what initially drew you to this space, pharma procurement and outsourcing, and what's been the sort of most eye-opening lesson you've learned about the strategic importance of supply selection?
First of all, thanks. Very nice to be with you, Dora. It's a real pleasure. So my journey into procurement actually has a couple of elements to it. One is quite a coincidence. I'm actually the third person in my family who's gone into procurement. My dad was in procurement working in aerospace, and his dad, so my granddad, was in the automotive industry and procurement as well. The other part is my journey really was a roundabout one, like many procurement professionals that I speak to, actually. I studied economics originally with a view to going into financial services or being an economist even. But as I graduated, the financial crisis hit. And so jobs in financial services was all of a sudden not that easy to get. So I was able to work in a pharmaceutical company in supply planning and operations just after I completed my degree. And then I was able to join a graduate program in supply chain management. And that's where I got my first taste of procurement with a placement in a procurement team. I then joined that team permanently and worked my way through the ranks over several years with responsibilities for things like API procurement and then managing a large CMO network. And then in 2023, with my good friend Graham Phillipson, we created the company that we now direct ourselves, which is Collaborative Sourcing. So we're a procurement consultancy dedicated to the pharmaceutical industry, and we aim to bring our collaborative approach to support procurement teams in those pharmaceutical companies. We are very fortunate now to be working with a wide range of different pharma companies. So from large established pharma giants to SMEs and to biotech startups, as well as with CDMOs and material manufacturers like API producers and things like this. And it's incredibly rewarding work.
Yeah. So at Collaborative Sourcing, I know you help pharma companies sort of break free of siloed procurement behaviours, as you call it. Many organisations still treat supplier selection as either a pure procurement decision focused on cost, or leave it entirely to R&D, who tend to prioritise speed and technical capabilities. So tell me then, why is this siloed approach so dangerous? And who would you say are the sort of non-negotiable players that need to be at the table from day one?
Well, siloed procurement is a big problem, as you say, Dora. A siloed approach often focuses by its nature on trying to solve one very specific objective or problem. And by doing that, what often happens is you invariably create more problems further down the line. This can often lead to, particularly with CDMO partnerships, might lead to project overruns, budget overruns. You might have project failures. So there's real dangers in taking a kind of siloed view of the selection process. Just to give you an example, we've recently been working with a client who are developing a wide range of new drug products, and they're using CDMOs for all of that development work. And so the CDMO selection, you would think, is a really crucial part of their pipeline. Getting those partnerships right is absolutely crucial for them. But previously, the selection of CDMOs was performed by a single person in the R&D team without any other discussions or interactions with any other part of the business. Now, while that individual may be incredibly experienced and have a lot of understanding of what CDMOs should bring, the team itself were actually targeted or measured on how many projects they could initiate and get started at CDMOs. So as you said earlier, time was the main factor. And it led to the selection process really being determined by simply who could start the soonest. And in one case, a CDMO was selected because it could start 2 weeks before another. Ultimately, in that particular instance, it led to a lack of due diligence being performed. And ultimately, that CDMO couldn't, in the end, support one of the key markets that product was destined for. And so it eventually led to about an 18-month delay in the project altogether. So there are some real dangers with that kind of approach. To avoid this sort of siloed supplier selection, we really believe that collaboration is the key. Most successful business partnerships are born from really deep collaboration. And that means right at the planning stage in that selection process as well. Collaborative planning means assembling a cross-functional core team before you even think about contacting any potential partners. That core team might look a little bit different depending on the size of your company, the resources that you have, the expertise that you have, and so on. In an ideal world, you would probably have a range of viewpoints. So someone from procurement who can perhaps lead the process and bring maybe market knowledge, negotiation expertise, and things like that. You would want to have people from quality and regulatory as well. So people are going to bring specific expertise in understanding compliance credentials, audit history, regulatory adherence, things like that. You want certainly to have someone with a scientific background, technical knowledge, so they can really dig into the credentials of what the CDMOs can offer. But as well, things like project management skills, if they're going to be leading the project, they can also bring those expertise as well. If possible, get your supply chain teams involved at the early stage as well. So they're going to be able to not only bring expertise in things like demand forecasting and understanding maybe the eventual volumes that you might require for commercial scale, but also things like logistics, lead time expectations, and inventory management, which are all really crucial considerations for commercial products. You'd also want legal advice as well. At the early stages, you might be sharing very sensitive information, confidential information with CDMOs during the selection process, and even your own intellectual property. So it's really important that you make sure that information is protected, that you're not sharing anything that you shouldn't be, but also that legal advice is going to be able to help you develop a view on how you will actually contract with that CDMO in the long term as well. And finally, I think a finance person as well is going to be able to help you not only understand maybe the financial health of partners before you build relationships with them, but also in the analysis of different quotations or proposals. Finance can often help with things like cash flow management, expectations, and total cost of ownership, things like that, really important. Just in case you're a startup with a really small team, you don't have all of these people within your organization already, it might be worth just having a conversation with somebody else, another colleague who maybe does bring a different perspective, who maybe has a little bit of different experience to you, or even a friend outside of the industry who can maybe bring a different perspective as well. Or if you're lucky enough to have maybe a trusted advisor or an external consultant, somebody who's just going to be able to bring another viewpoint.
Oh, that's so interesting, that case study you mentioned of for the sake of 2 weeks, and they ended up losing 18 months. That really does kind of show the kind of importance of this. But bringing so many people to the table, so many different kind of personas you mentioned, does that bring about different challenges in kind of how you would rate each persona's priorities, and how do people kind of tend to manage that?
Yeah, you want to be able to strike a right balance. So what can be really important in terms of creating that focus for that core team is to really think about what you're trying to achieve by entering into this project. Your project is, for example, selecting a CDMO partner. So why is it you're doing that? So what we to think about is when you've got that core team assembled, the first real objective for them is to try to develop a really crystal clear understanding of what it is you want to achieve and what that supplier, that CDMO, needs to deliver. So this we call the North Star. This is where you're going to define that strategic objective. So what's the primary goal of that project? So is it to launch a new product? Is it to optimize something in the process? Is it to reduce cost or reduce risk? It can also be to increase capacity. So really have a think and be clear on what it is that you're trying to achieve. And sometimes you might have multiple objectives, but then just try to rank them so you have a really clear understanding of your primary goal.
Great, thanks for that. And so, yeah, with this kind of North Star that you mentioned, creating sort of an ideal supplier profile, what are the essential steps that you would say you need to set everything up for success?
As I said, the first objective would be to create that really clear strategy, what it is you're trying to achieve. That's number one. Once you've got that, you then want to develop a really clear and detailed scope of work. That is where definitely you're going to need the support of your technical teams and your R&D teams, also quality and regulatory. But this is going to be the real foundation of what it is that you're going to be proposing to partners in the future. So it needs to be really detailed and really clear. This is going to perhaps include specific equipment or specific modalities that the CDMO needs to be able to support. It could include things like specific regulatory approvals. But you've got to be really specific here. It's really important. What's just as important here as well is what not to include or what you're explicitly going to exclude from the scope. So we see very often projects grow and morph and grow legs by having lots of additional things thrown at them throughout that process. It's really important that you don't add on things that aren't actually essential to achieving your objective. So it might be, for example, additional regulatory requirements that are actually outside of the scope of your strategy. It might be additional quality requirements. Now, they're often done because you want to have the very highest standards, and that's a good goal. But actually, are they going to hamper you in your search for the right CDMO partner? By adding on these additional requirements, you're going to be reducing that pool of potential partners. And what can often start as a really achievable objective actually might become kind of mission impossible. So that's really important.
Yeah, interesting. So setting your primary objectives from the start and making sure to continue being aware of your priorities as you go through the process. So let's talk about then your RFX approach, RFI, RFP, RFQ. What are the biggest mistakes you see pharma companies make in this process? Would you say they kind of jump straight to the pricing when they should be kind of exploring capabilities, or the other way, kind of getting too detailed too early in the process?
Well, RFX can be a very complicated process, and lots of people, and then whether they're in procurement or not, can misuse or misunderstand what each part of that kind of means. So there are several common mistakes I think people tend to make. One is, what are the options? So you've got RFI, which is a request for information. That's a really easy and simple one. So you're trying to understand what the market looks like, essentially. So if, for example, your objective is to find a CDMO who can support the development of a sterile injectable, then you want to inquire with companies, well, can they produce sterile injectable products? So that it's really simple. You might be asking for simple things like company information, history, geographic location, how many sites they have, what modalities can they support, what regulatory authorities they are approved by, really basics like that. So that's going to bring a really big long list down to a manageable list of companies that you know can broadly support what you're trying to achieve. The next one is an RFP, which is a request for proposal. Now, this is best used when you know you have a problem to solve or an objective, but you don't actually know how to solve it yourself. So you're looking for someone else to come with their solutions. So it might be that you have a formulation which has been developed, but you maybe have some issues with stability or impurities. Well, a request for a proposal could be used to say, well, this is the problem we're having. Can you propose to us how you might solve it? So that's a good way to think of a proposal. And then the one that is used very often is an RFQ, or a request for quotation. But a request for quotation needs to be restricted to only being used when you already have a very clear specification of what it is that you want to purchase. So it's best used for things like materials, so like an API, where you have a very clear specification, maybe physical properties as well. So you can say, can you as a supplier match this specification? Yes or no? The next problem that we see with the RFX is the RFX in itself. So often companies will not provide enough information in it, or they'll provide too much. So the problem with not enough information is obviously then partners are going to maybe misinterpret or misunderstand what it is that you're trying to achieve. And then they might be proposing stuff that is totally wrong for you. So you're going to have a lot of wasted time and effort. The problem with having too much information is that your really clear strategic objective can be lost in amongst a sea of other details. And then your partners or your candidates may also become lost in the weeds of that detail. So by striking the right balance of having a very specific and well-defined scope of work and a really clear objective built into your RFX, you can ensure that your candidates are going to really be able to understand easily and provide the best possible solutions to it.
I see. Great. Thanks for that. And so I know you use a methodology called the 5Cs for supplier evaluation. Can you break this down, what each C represents, and give us an example of how this framework can help prevent bad supply decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've developed the 5Cs methodology, which, as you say, is for supplier evaluation. It's a way of ensuring that you consider a broad range of those perspectives, a bit like earlier when we were talking about having different people in the room. So instead of focusing purely on one metric or one measure to evaluate a supplier, for example, like we said earlier, speed was just the one measure. So to avoid that, the 5Cs are capability. So this is when you're evaluating your partner, are they actually capable of doing what you need them to do? Do they have the right equipment? Do they have the right expertise and experience? Maybe do they have a good track record in that area? So that's really important. The next C is capacity. So both in terms of people as well as in equipment and facilities. So capacity can include things like project management capacity. Can they actually start your project when you want them to? Do they have the ability to flex and adapt as those timelines may evolve over time? But also, do they have the capacity with the equipment? Can they make the right sort of batch size for you? Do they have the ability to grow with you if your product is really successful? So those are the sorts of considerations to think about with regard to capacity. The third C is cost. Now, obviously, cost is really important, but it shouldn't be the only thing. And we don't want to be thinking just about the initial price. We want to be thinking about the total cost and the total impact of that financially on your organization. So it should include upfront costs, milestone payments, payment terms. How will the cash flow for your organization be managed during this project? We do recommend using a total cost of ownership analysis, which you might need to get some help from your finance teams with to develop. But by doing that, you'll be able to bring all of these different costs together to understand the long-term cost to your organization, which is really helpful. The fourth C is compliance. With any pharmaceutical product, you're going to want to include quality and regulatory compliance requirements, but also think about ESG compliance as well, and maybe things like safety and treatment of workers and things like this. Lots of companies are looking beyond just standard compliance metrics and looking to evaluate suppliers for many more areas as well. And then the final C is collaboration. How well do you think this partner is going to integrate with your team and your company? How do they communicate? What's their style? How do they approach problem solving? Do you see them as a long-term partner? Does their company culture and their objectives align well with your own? So these things are really important to evaluate. And then for each of these 5 areas, design a metric that you can use. So it might be that total cost of ownership metric. It might be a quality or ESG metric. Decide on what metrics you're going to use, and then assign each one a weighting depending on your strategic objective overall. And that can really help you evaluate consistently across multiple candidates.
Right. Interesting. So when you're down to your final 2 to 3 candidates then after this process and initial kind of evaluation, what does your deeper dive assessment process look like? What key things are you looking for in a site visit, for example, that you can't get from these proposals?
Definitely. Once you're down to those last 2 or 3 candidates, by the way, which should all then already meet all of your requirements on paper and hopefully be really good candidates and stand out, it's then time to start to build a much deeper understanding of them. And this is a good opportunity to start building and forming those relationships as well. So for this, a visit to their facility is absolutely crucial. When I was a buyer, I made a really specific point of never entering into a new agreement with a company before I'd visited at least once before. If at all possible, when you perform these visits, bring as many of that team that you've assembled with you as possible, because they're going to be your additional eyes and ears. That's really helpful. So what you're looking to do during those visits is to prove or disprove all of the assumptions that you've made so far. So do they have the equipment that they say they have? Do they have the capacity and expertise as you meet people? But you're also looking for other signs too. So how busy or quiet do they appear to be in their operations? How do the people treat each other when you walk around? Are people quite engaged and interested in their work? And as well, some of the basic telltale signs of a company might be how good their facilities look. Are they tidy and well maintained, or are they looking a bit old and shabby? Over the years, I think I've been given great tips by different people in procurement about what to look for. One of my go-tos is to always visit the warehouse, so you see what's going in and out of the company. It's a great way of spotting things like customer labels on goods, so you can see maybe which other partners are trusting them with their products and projects, which is really useful. And as well, you might see goods coming in. Are they from companies you recognize? Are they reputable? You might not know them on the day, but you can check them out later and see. And also how full a warehouse might be could be a good or a bad sign. How old is that stock that got there? How long has it been sitting there? Is it moving quite fast? These things give you a much greater sense of a company in its actual operation than the company presentations will have done, or those kind of talks with the sales teams.
Gosh, yeah. How interesting. There's so many sort of nuances that you've said that you wouldn't think of initially as being important, but then actually, whether an employee, it seems like they actually enjoy their job, could make a significant impact in how they approach working with your company, couldn't it? So let's talk now then about how procurement priorities are sort of shifting. So with recent supply chain disruptions, increasing ESG requirements, like you mentioned before, how has supply evaluation evolved? Are there any new criteria that you're weighing in that weren't priorities sort of five or so years ago?
Yeah, I would say the past 5 years have really seen a major shift in priorities for procurement teams. When I first started, the sole objective or the focus really was on cost. How can we find this material or this product lower cost or than we paid previously? All procurement teams were measured on savings, purely savings. And really, if you weren't reducing cost every year, you really weren't doing your job. So it was a very different time, I think. So probably since then, I would say there's two major shifts, I think. One is the increased focus on sustainability and ESG more widely. And then the second one probably being as a result of the COVID pandemic on resilience and supply chain risk. I think the increased focus on sustainability has really come from two main routes. One, I think more people are just much more aware of their own personal impact on the planet. So what they're buying, what they're using, how they're using it, how they're recycling it. And that I think has fed into boardrooms and into senior executives' objectives as well for their companies. There are definitely more organizations now wanting to contribute to a much more sustainable planet, especially when they're thinking about their children's future or their grandchildren's future. So I think that's the first one. I think the second one has been government regulation and incentives. Many more companies now are being targeted with specific climate goals, which is a fantastic thing. You could say we should be doing more, but there's certainly been a big shift in recent years, and that has definitely fed into procurement as well. So I think both from sustainability and from the impact of COVID, I think these things have really empowered procurement and supply chain teams to help them dig much deeper into the supply chains of the companies that they're working with. It's now pretty much expected that suppliers will provide detailed information about their suppliers and their suppliers' suppliers. And this mapping, this sort of tier 1 to tier 3 mapping, which we call it, enables organizations to much more accurately calculate their climate impacts, which is fantastic, but also to understand the levels of risk in their supply chains as well. So it's really had a great benefit in problem solving as well.
Yeah. Scope 3 is, a huge kind of portion of companies meeting their sustainability goals, right? And so that really weighs heavily on outsourcing partners. So it's such a big impact on those sustainability goals, choosing this outsourcing partner. And so let's talk about then timeline expectations for supplier selection, because I understand they can be a source of friction. So how do you set realistic expectations with internal stakeholders about how long strategic selection usually takes?
Well, I'm sure we've all probably seen that sort of friction that you mentioned. Teams will often be accused of slowing the project down by taking time to make these sorts of decisions. I think that the starting point should be for everyone to be clear on is when you're selecting a new supplier, say a CDMO, and you've never worked with them before, you're going to carry some level of risk. You're trusting them to do something for you, but you don't know them very well already. Will they be able to do what they say? Will they deliver it on time and in budget? By definition, outsourcing means you're trusting somebody else to do it for you. So what you're trying to do throughout the selection evaluation process is reduce that level of risk as much as possible. So that's really the key, to build as much knowledge about your candidates as possible so that you can make a judgment on, do you trust them to be able to deliver for you? So however long that process is going to take, at some point, you're going to have to make a decision. So all you're trying to do is get to as much information as quickly as possible. So what we recommend to our clients is that by following a clear set of principles that we've laid out, so to have that diverse range of perspectives, to have that crystal clear North Star, that strategic objective, to have the right RFX and a clear, well-defined evaluation criteria, and by visiting them to deepen your understanding, you're going to be able to reach that informed decision much more quickly. The speed is really going to depend on the urgency and the accountability of the people that you're working with and your company. You can imagine that for some large organizations with big teams, even just assembling that team in the first place might take them a few weeks. But with a smaller, more agile organization, you could all get into a room, you could have all of these processes defined in a single day and be ready to send out your RFP tomorrow. It really does depend on how important it is to you and how much people are going to bring and how they're going to bring that to the table.
Right, interesting. Let's move on to talk about contract negotiation then, because it's a key area that determines whether your carefully selected supply relationship will actually deliver the strategic value that you plan for. So how do you approach negotiations strategically? And what does a true win-win negotiation look like in pharma outsourcing?
I think the important thing is to think of contract negotiation as a means to an end. So it's not the end in itself. And I'm sure for anyone in procurement listening, they would have seen it so many times before. You work so hard on getting a contract signed after such a long period, and then you immediately move on to something else. The next project comes up, or the next problem comes up, and you forget about it. And that relationship that had so much promise starts to wither a little bit. So really importantly, think of it as part of the overall process. So when you're selecting a new supplier, especially in the pharma world where relationships tend to be very long, it's essential that you think about the partnership as an objective in itself. What I mean by that is that both parties should be thinking about how they're going to make that partnership as successful as possible, how they can make it grow. And that's what we mean by a win-win. What you want to avoid is thinking about what can we gain at the expense of the other party. So that's a win-lose. A simple analogy, I think, is to think of a win-lose relationship as like you're sharing a pie, and the bigger slice that you take, it leaves less for the other party.
Yeah.
Whereas in a win-win, you're both trying to make that pie grow and be bigger. So you're adding in more ingredients all the time, bringing innovations or bringing new ideas to help it grow. And then whichever proportion you get, it's always going to be bigger. That's the really important way of thinking about it. So in terms of contract negotiation, the best way that we recommend to start is by developing what we call a shared vision with your partner. So just like a little bit earlier when we were talking about developing your North Star, so what you want to achieve from this project, similarly, your shared vision is then done with your partner to create a vision of what that partnership will look like in the future. So it might start with something like, our shared vision is to co-develop and commercialize this product. Really simple. It might be our shared vision is to build a resilient and cost-effective supply chain for this product, something like that. You also then want to include some objectives and some commitments in there. Company A might be committing to providing timely data on clinical trials or something like that. Or company B is committing to agile manufacturing or something. And the commitment could be 100% delivery on time of clinical batches, as an example. So what you're doing is you're creating that shared vision together so that when you do go into contract negotiation, because you already have that buy-in and that shared vision of the future, you're negotiating clauses are very simple. They're so much smoother because you just have to take it back to, does this help develop and grow that partnership to meet our shared vision?
Oh, interesting. So how do you then quantify these shared visions? For example, company A being agile or company B focusing on innovation. How can these be quantified and measured so that you can tell that this partnership has been successful?
It's a good question, Dora. So one of the examples, as I shared, might be specific delivery requirements on certain products or trials or something like that. But you might also want to commit to a particular communication style or set of behaviors. You might say, we agree or we commit to meeting once a month, face to face, to go through maybe issues that have occurred or maybe ideas that have come up to improve the process. So you can really tailor that shared vision to really target your objectives. But by doing it together, you make sure that you're both developing that mutual trust in the process that will follow.
Yeah, really, really nice. So looking ahead then, do you have one main piece of advice that you would give to a pharma or biotech executive who's about to kind of embark on their first major CDMO selection? And do you see any kind of big opportunities for improving procurement outcomes in our industry overall?
I think the one piece of advice I would give to anybody starting out in their first CDMO selection process, I think, would be to have that vision of you're going to find a strategic partner that you trust and have honest and transparent conversations with. That's the best way to start that search. If you can imagine having a long-term 5 to 10 year business relationship with that other party as you go through that process, that's a really good sign. Conversely, if you have a little doubt or a bit of distrust that you can't really seem to shake off as you go through all of those steps, then first of all, rely on the data. So the evaluation that you've done, go with that because that's going to be consistent and be able to tell you the facts. But also don't ignore your gut instinct. Talk it through with your team, see if they feel the same. That's a really good signal sometimes of something not quite adding up. CDMOs are often being selected for incredibly important strategic projects. Sometimes these projects are the foundation of these companies. These are what they're pinning all their hopes on. So it's really important that CDMO selection process is done correctly. It's worse to pick the wrong partner than it is to pick nobody at all. You can always go back and start again if you need to. So I think in selecting the right partner, you're giving your project the greatest chance of success, and ultimately for your drug product to reach the market and to reach patients.
Great. What a nice sentiment to end on. Thanks a lot for joining me today, Matthew. It's been great.